My name is Nancy Roberts, and I'm an economics professor at Arizona State University. Today I want to talk about trade and restrictions on free trade, and furthermore restrictions in a specific way where we restrict free trade using quotas rather than tariffs. And in a previous video we looked at this same graph here where I have a domestic demand, domestic supply. The closed economy price is $30 and the closed quantity is 400 units. And we looked at consumer and producer surplus when the economy was closed and it was $8,000. Then the next thing I did was I said, well, what if we introduce free trade? And so if we introduce free trade, we increase the supply of shoes into this economy. And the free trade price turned out to be $15, and 700 was the quantity demanded at a price of $15. We would have 600 imports if in fact supply increased this much and the price were $15. And in that case, we then measured consumer surplus and producer surplus, and we found that the surplus within the economy increased from 8,000 to 12,500. So this was good for the economy. Now, consumers were the big beneficiaries of these imports into the economy, and domestic producers were hurt by this because their production level went from 400 down to 100. And so the next thing we did was we said, well, domestic producers would lobby for tariffs on these imported shoes. And so if this was the supply, the free trade supply, if domestic producers convinced the legislature to impose a tariff or a tax on these imported shoes, then what it would just do is raise the cost. These foreign producers could bring in shoes, but they'd have to pay the government $5 every time they brought in a new pair of shoes, which in essence would raise the supply curve this much, which would decrease the supply. The new price would be $20, and 600 would be demanded, and 200 would be produced domestically. So what we would have is now 400 imports instead of 600 with free trade. So with this $5 tariff, we managed to reduce imports to 400, and this benefited the domestic producer. But we also saw that it reduced the surplus within the economy. Even though the government, we introduced a third agent here because now we have consumers, producers, and the government collecting the tariff, we still lost these two triangular areas here. Now what I want to do is explain another technique to reduce imports into the domestic economy, but we're not going to impose a tariff or a tax. What we're going to do is we're going to set a quota. We're going to tell these foreign producers of shoes, you can import shoes into the domestic economy, but you can only import a certain number. We're setting a quota. And what I want to do is set that quota at 400 because I want to compare a quota of 400 to a tariff that reduced imports to 400. And we'll see how they impact the domestic economy differently. So, if this is free trade, and we tell these foreign shoe manufacturers, you can only import 400 of these shoes into the economy, then in essence what we're doing is we're taking this domestic supply curve and we're shifting it out by 400. And if we do that, shift it out by 400, what you will find is that right here at a price of $20, this point on the domestic supply curve, if we increase the supply by 400, my new supply curve would come through right here. This would be my quota. So taking the domestic supply curve and adding 400 units to it at every price, this is my new, I'll call it S prime. And you will notice the price is the same, $20. 600 would be demanded, 400 of those would be imports. The price would be $20. When we look at consumer and producer surplus and how this compares with free trade, in other words, what we've done is we've restricted imports into the economy to just 400, and we've used a quota instead of a tariff. And so let's look at surplus within the economy when we do that. So we can add up our areas again here. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And so now with this quota, consumer surplus is area 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is the same as it was with the tariff. So consumer surplus with the quota is going to equal 9,000. 1/2 based on type. Producer surplus is going to be the same as it was with the quota. It's going to be area 5 and 10. Producer surplus equals $1,000. So now we've accounted for areas 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 10. We're left with 6, 7, 8, and 9 that we haven't accounted for. This used to be part of consumer surplus in free trade. When we restrict imports using this quota method, the government doesn't collect a tariff. There's no tax. So 7 and 8, in fact, goes to the foreign shoe manufacturers because they're going to charge a price of $20 and they don't have to pay the government $5 on each of these imports. So what's lost to the economy is 6, 7, 8, and 9. And so with a quota, our total surplus is 10,000. When you compare this 10,000 with this 12,000. They're similar in that the number of imports is 400 in each case. But if you do it with a tariff, at least the domestic government collects 7 and 8. If you do it with a quota, 7 and 8 is gone from the economy. So if your choice is restrict imports to a certain number using a tariff or using a quota, from the domestic economy's perspective, a tariff is preferable. That just means the government, in essence, picks up some money. In the case of the quota, the government doesn't. One more thing we should say about free trade, and when we think about trade, we often think about domestic producers because there are going to be jobs lost. If you bring in foreign shoes, domestic shoemakers are going to be hurt. And so a lot of people want to defend protectionism on the basis of protecting American jobs. That's why it's often called protectionism. But you know, if we have free trade goes both ways, imports and exports. So if we allow other countries to import into our country, then we would expect those other countries to allow us to export into their country. And what happens is, yes, there are jobs lost in this domestic economy when imports come in, but if you will remember the graph we did, I'll just draw it small up here, supply, demand. If we export to the rest of the world, when the economy was closed, this is how much we would produce, Q star. But if the domestic economy exports wheat to the rest of the world, then our production level is going to increase this much. And so these people who used to make shoes can now help make new tractors and new farm equipment and new, it requires a mobility of resources. And America's pretty good at mobility of resources. It's one of the reasons why our economy generally is in pretty good shape, because resources are very mobile. But that's what should happen. This economy shrinks, this economy expands. Workers move from this economy to this economy. And efficiency is improved, wealth is increased, and so trade is a good thing. That's it.